Hello and welcome. I am Exit Light and this is my channel. Today's video is going to be different than probably any video I've ever done. We are going to have a conversation. Well, it's a one-sided conversation. And I'm going to tell you the behind-the-scenes activity that occurred that caused me and everyone involved with my podcasts to agree that we would not talk about paranormal subjects for a while on my podcasts. So this is going to be unedited. If I mess up on a word, it's going to be caught. If you hear my dog's collar jangling in the background, it's going to be caught. I just want to come at you and tell you what I experienced and what some of the people involved with my podcasts experienced, and why, in all honesty, I was scared to the point of not wanting to do another podcast that had to do with the paranormal, and how we are going to start back up doing that. Anyway, all right, you might notice that there might be a time where I pause this recording and take a minute to get my thoughts together, but that still won't be edited. It's just going to be a one and done. So if you want to know what happened behind the scenes to cause me and a couple of other people involved with my podcast to all agree that we were not going to talk about anything paranormal, such as demons and ghosts and things like that, then please stick around. And I have a couple of recordings that you might be interested in hearing. So here we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read producer Jeremy's little statement about what happened, what he saw happen, what he experienced. I'm going to also read my guest host Rob's statement on what he experienced happening. And then I'm going to tell you the story that puts all of this together and tells you about an experience that I had that, I talk about hauntings, and I am very open about my paranormal experiences. I never shy away from it. I've been scratched, as you have all heard, or maybe not if you're here for the first time. I've been scratched to the point where there was blood coming out of the scratches. I am not afraid to talk about those subjects, but this particular subject I haven't spoken about in over 2 months because of what it did to me. And I am not, as I hope most of you know, easily scared or frightened about these topics, or I wouldn't have this channel. So let's get started, and I'll read you Jeremy's note about what he experienced from his point of view. Here we go. So Jeremy's note starts out at, we were about halfway through a podcast about ghost encounters. And I'm going to clarify, and Jory and I had done a podcast about our true paranormal experiences. I am sitting in the control room with Maya and her brother Josh. I have my headphones on, which make it easier to hear quiet sounds or background noise. In a conversation about the family's past ghost experiences, I heard a whisper. It extended for a long time, but I couldn't make out the string of words. I leaned over to Josh and said, "Grandpa Bob must be cracking jokes." Tracy's father was visiting and was in the room where Tracy was recording. Moments after I heard it, Tracy's husband ran into the control room and asks me if I played a creepy whisper sound on the podcast. And let me explain that a little bit. Jory and I were talking, and he was telling a story about being downstairs in a home we owned, and how he heard voices whispering in that room. My husband thought that Jeremy had played a sound effect. Jeremy goes on to say, "I had not." Her husband was in the room with her father and Tracy, and all three claimed that no one was whispering. Not long after, Jory, who was on the podcast that night, said a bad car accident had occurred outside of his house, and at that very moment, Tracy's nose began to bleed heavily, and she called us in to the room for help. Now let me explain this part. My father and my husband were in the control room talking about the whispering that they had heard. And the way I have my setup is that I have a laptop, my iPad, my phone, because sometimes we text each other during the podcast and say something like, "Hey, Jory, I can hear something scratching on your mic. Can you figure out what that is?" Something like that. And I have what I drink during my podcast, which is coffee and iced tea. So I didn't have anything around me to use to help to stop the blood, and I was using one of my hands to catch the blood. So I put my mic on mute and said, "I need help me." So let's get back to what Jeremy was saying. At that very moment, Tracy's nose began to bleed heavily, and she called us into the room for help as we all stood in shock on our faces. It was a very on night, but that was only the beginning. Not even a week after that night, something else much worse occurred. It was early in the morning, and we had dropped Tracy back off at her house. I had given my daughter and Jeremy my car, and I had gone to a doctor's appointment. And, well, I'll read Jeremy's statement, and then I'll tell you my version when I'm done. Maya and I were driving to my house when Tracy called us. I picked up the phone, and with a frantic gasp, I heard, "Tell Maya to turn around. I need help." So we did. On our way back to the house, I stayed on the phone with Tracy, trying to assess the situation and calm her down. It sounded as if she put the phone down in another room and had walked off, but I could hear her faintly gasping and coughing. I stayed on the phone to reassure her. We had no idea what was happening, but we rushed back to her. As we neared the house, there was more distant coughing growing. It was just before we got there that I heard what I can only describe as a sinister growl. It sounded like an agitated and aggressive animal close by the phone. Tracy still sounded far away, however. We rushed into the house and saw Tracy on her hands and knees, gasping for air, with a bag under her. We went up to her as she exclaimed how it felt as if something was choking her. I rubbed her back to tell her it will be okay as Maya runs to get a crucifix. Both the dogs were in another room behind a closed door. Tracy laid there composing herself, while the phone lay on a coffee table roughly 20 feet away. I held on to what I heard, but did not tell Tracy until recently. Now what I'm going to do is read you something that Rob sent, a note that Rob sent, and then I'll tell another story, which would be mine. Okay, so here's Rob's note. We had done a podcast about demons. There were some strange occurrences on Tracy's end, but Tracy had kept mum about the phenomena. The next morning, we were messaging each other about the previous night. And as a side note, the way Rob and I communicate sometimes is through Facebook Messenger, and we send 1-minute voice clips back and forth to each other. Tracy sent me a recorded message. As I was looking and listening to the message, I heard something really scary. I messaged Tracy right away and asked her to listen back to her last message. I didn't say why. I didn't say that there was something there. So Tracy listened, and then she messaged me really shook up. And I don't want to... I've decided. I think it's like the Ouija board. You open a door, and I don't think that should be done right now. As this was happening, I was actually due for my medication. He had a delivery where his medication was delivered to his door. He said that I was not holding my phone, and then suddenly my phone started ringing, and it was Tracy. She stopped ringing me, so I rang her straight away to ask her what was wrong, why she was ringing me, and she said that I had rang her. We were both really confused and speechless. I don't think I have told this to Tracy, but the next couple of nights were really bad for me. Bad dreams, shadow figures, just really uneasy. All right. I will say in here real quickly what had happened was that he said, Tracy, listen to your last message. Will you do me a favor and listen to your last message? And so I said, okay. And I was listening to it, and then I heard this, and I was responding. And right then, it came up and said I was receiving a call from Rob through Facebook, which I had never received a call from Rob before. And I thought he must have pushed a wrong button, and I declined it. And I was sending him a message saying, I think you must have pushed a wrong button. When he called again, and this time I answered it, and he said, why did you call? And I said, I didn't call. You called me. Well, on his end, it said that I had called him. On my end, it said that he had called me. And what's particularly important to note about this is that I, because things were sort of building up in their strength of what was happening, I wanted to get off. I didn't want to have a conversation about this anymore. And we agreed to get off the phone. And we didn't talk about what we had both heard. So, ironically, this phone call caused us to not speak about the noise we had both just experienced on the phone. So now I'm going to tell you, from my point of view, what led me to want to skip doing paranormal topics and what the climax of the situation was that frightened me and the people around me including my husband, enough to say, I am not doing paranormal topics, at least for a little while. And at the point, I didn't want to do them ever again. So, let me get into that. So, like we talked about, we were doing that video on our own paranormal experiences, which is not something, like I said, that I am afraid to talk about. I have several videos about my experiences with the paranormal. I have a video about me being scratched. I have been scratched twice. Once on my side, once on my hand. It didn't scare me enough to not talk about paranormal activity, which might have been my bad. I've had my child apparently locked in a room with a force holding a door closed so that we couldn't get in to the room. We've had several experiences. I mean, I can go on and on and on. You can go through my playlist and listen to the experiences that I've had with the paranormal. So that happened that night where my nose was bleeding and whatnot. Well, we had done a podcast with just Rob and I, too. And Jory was listening. And Jory sent a text to moderator Maya and told her that he heard a child on the recording say, "Mom, Mom." And sure enough, we went back and listened to it, and we could hear it too. Now, this is the voice I sometimes hear calling me in my room. It's a boy. I've had this boy with me since I was 21 years old. It's something I am used to. And I'm going to say now that I will never use the words used to, acceptable, not worried, not scared, or entertainment, or entertaining, or funny, or strange, or anything that minimizes what is actually happening. Because I feel that lets your guard down and perhaps allows something to take advantage of the fact, or angers something that wants you to give it more clout than you're giving it. It's easy to have an experience and then years later say, this happened to me, it was really weird, I had a scratch, everybody saw it being scratched, it was so weird, blah, 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 without having the defenses up. And that's something that when we go forward and we do paranormal podcasts from now on, that won't happen. We can have laughing moments and that type of thing, but I will bear in mind that these are real and there are real consequences and that there are real dangers. So going forward, we did the Demon podcast, and that night after I got off the podcast, I was extremely tired, as though I had just used all my energy for this podcast. And for those of you who comment on my videos, you will know that I am a night owl, that you can message me at all hours of the night and I will respond. I'm a night owl. I'm nocturnal. I fully admit that. But on this night, I went to bed right after the podcast, and it had been an early podcast because it was the UK podcast, which is started at 4 p.m. my time. So I went to bed. Now, I have told a story in the podcasts, I believe, about me having taken an antibiotic one time that I had a really bad reaction to. One of the symptoms of this antibiotic was dissociative disorder and not feeling like yourself, having bad nightmares. And if you don't know, this dissociative disorder means that you can look in the mirror and not see that reflection as you. I had a very bad reaction where I had what I call, there's 4 levels of consciousness in a dream state, okay? And I experienced everything from the first one to the 4th one. And oddly enough, I was telling my father about this one time, and he said that he had been on the exact same antibiotic and had a very similar experience to mine. His doctor took him off and wrote that he was allergic. My doctor said, power through, commit. And what this would do was, there is a dream state, like everybody has. Then there is a sleep paralysis stage, where is a night terror stage, which not everybody has, but is not uncommon. Then there is a 3rd stage below that, where you are conscious. It's very, very dark. It feels as though you're in a room. You sometimes can feel that there is maybe somebody in the room with you. And to me, it takes me out of the sleep paralysis by making me feel as though I'm going to faint. And then I feel myself being pulled down into this 3rd level. And I can sometimes now try and get myself out of the 3rd level to sleep paralysis, which I am much more easily able to get myself out of after years of night terrors. So, but sometimes this 3rd level causes you to believe that you have gotten yourself into the sleep paralysis stage, but you have not. Then there is a 4th stage, which I can only describe as being something in the cortex of your brain that knows or remembers extreme fear. Fear doesn't cover the feeling. It's pure terror. It is dark, but you can sort of see it. It's cavernous, and there's sharp stones, like crystals, the way they grow, jutting down and up all around you. In this stage, I am on this flat pedestal type of thing. And it sounds as though it's echoing in this cavernous place. And there, in this place, is a dark entity. It feels to me as close as the word hell could be described. It's cold. It feels like you are completely unconnected to anything. And this force, this evil, dark force, is just there. And that is a level I cannot get out of unless I am physically touched. The first time that ever happened to me on that antibiotic, I was touched by my dog. and I was able to come up through the other 3 levels. But this time, after the demon podcast, I was not on medication. I was not on this antibiotic. I laid down and I felt myself go into sleep paralysis. And I noticed that it wasn't usual. I have a typical sleep paralysis experience where I hear footsteps walking down an empty corridor as though you are in a school building or a hospital and it's completely empty and your footprints echo off of all the walls. And then I feel someone come into the room with me and get on top of me. This was not happening, and I was conscious of this, and I made a note of that. It wasn't happening, and then I felt a dark presence, and I tried to fight it. I felt as though I was going to faint. That I think I'm going to faint feeling, but I was in the stage 2, in sleep paralysis, and it pulled me down to stage 3. And then it pulled me down to stage 4. And this presence was so overwhelming. And I was so aware that I was in stage 4, which automatically petrifies me because I know that I can't get out of stage 4. And my youngest son was in the living room, and I didn't have anybody or anything there that could touch me in reality and help me get out. So I kept fighting to get to stage 3 and to get to stage 2. And I would think that I was in a state where I could wake up and I would feel it pull. And I did this for an hour. This exhausting hour where I had to fight this dark entity which was feeling very intentional. This was something that was being done to me. I was very conscious of it. At one point, I pulled myself up to sleep paralysis. And I thought, okay, I'm going to get out of this. I'm going to get out of this. And I started to make the muscles in my eyes try and open. And I felt this feeling in my body, this buzzing, tingling feeling. And it started in my legs and moved up my body. And I said, oh shit. Because it wasn't something I'd ever felt before. In the years I've had sleep paralysis, I've gained what I call tools to help me get out of these types of situations. And I knew immediately that this was something I didn't have the tools for. That this entity had a control over me that I'd only been being toyed with up until this point. And literally in my mind said, oh shit. Out of fear because I didn't know what was going to happen. And then it happened. Let me take a moment. Okay. Suddenly, both of my ears were filled with this whispering sound, these whispering voices. Like that in my ears. And it was louder and louder. And I remember saying, I don't understand you. I don't understand what you're saying. And it became louder and louder and began to feel as though my head was being crushed in a vice by these voices, while my body was still having this tingling feeling, and I felt as though I was going to be pulled out to, I don't know, level 4, level 3, out, maybe somewhere else. And I'm fighting with all my might because my head is being crushed, and I think I might die. And I'm forcing my eyes to open and trying to get myself out. And I open my eye and I see a light on my Amazon Echo Dot. There was an alarm going off that I had not set. And I can see the light in the distance. And I kept saying to myself, the light is reality, the light is reality, the light is reality, the light is reality. Until I jumped up. Jumped. My muscles, my whole being sat straight up and jumped. And I came out into the living room, and my son said, "What is wrong with you? What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you?" And I couldn't articulate what I had experienced. What do you call that? I might have told him I had a night terror or something. I can't even remember. And I went and got something to drink. I said, I need something. I need something to drink. I need something. And it felt like almost like I needed to touch reality. I needed to take something in that was real. And I got on the computer, and it's the same time that Rob wakes up in the UK. And I sent him a message and said, "Are you there?" I didn't want to wake my husband up. He had to be at work very early in the morning. And I started to type out what was happening. And he said, I'm calling you for actual real this time. And he called, and I just bawled. I just cried. Because this scared me so badly that I can't put into words the darkness and the evil that I felt. I spoke with my husband a couple hours later, and I told him the same thing, that explained everything that happened, and that I was petrified. And his immediate reaction was, stop doing the podcasts. Stop. I stayed up for the rest of the night, and I went to my early doctor's appointment. And as we were leaving the doctor's appointment, I felt as though I was being choked. That from the inside. I don't know how to describe it other than it felt like I had swallowed a golf ball and it was pushing out. And I had my daughter pull over the car and I opened the door because my first instinct was I think I have to throw up. I think I'm gonna be sick because I didn't know what that pressure was, and I couldn't breathe very well. And then it went away. We grabbed breakfast. We came home. I, in the meantime, told them what had happened to me and what I had experienced. And again, I was shaking and crying. I got out of the car. I let myself in the door. And the second my foot stepped into my home, I had that choking feeling. And it was stronger. And again, my first instinct was, I have to throw up or I'm not going to be able to breathe. And I grabbed a grocery bag and I started to become sick. I put my phone down on the coffee table in my living room. I pushed the first number and it happened to be Jeremy's. And I said, I need help. Tell Maya I need help. I need help. And I, for some reason, ended up close to the front of my door. And like Jeremy said, 20 feet away from my phone. And I was coughing and gagging and throwing up, trying to get this choking away from me. I couldn't take a full breath. And I could hear Jeremy on the phone, and I could hear him saying things on the phone, but I could not respond in any way. And they came running through my door and found me there. And I was hysterical, crying. A sobbing, crying, choking mess. And after several minutes, I finally started feeling better. Maya ran into my room, and I have these tiny blessed crosses that I was given in the last place I lived because of the experiences, the scratching on my side, etc. that happened there. And I'm holding it right now. She brought it out to me, and she prayed. Her and I prayed. And after that final experience, I talked to everybody involved with the podcast. Maya, Jeremy, Rob, Jory, and my husband, of course. And told them I was afraid that if I pushed, something could go very wrong. I mean, more wrong than it already had been, as the incidences and the strength of the incidences had been increasing on a regular basis. And the other night we had a podcast about fairy tales. And at the end of the fairy tale podcast, somebody said something about paranormal, and I said, yeah, speaking about that. And then I said, never mind. And Jeremy in my ear and said, yeah, no. And Rob said, yeah, no. And we got off the phone. I called Jeremy, and I always talk to everybody after the podcast to say, what'd you think? How'd it go? Did you get everything out you wanted to say, etc.? And I said, you know what, Jeremy? I think that it's time to just go ahead and start talking about paranormal stuff again. I feel like I've taken two and a half months off, and in that amount of time, I have really, really worked on the way I'm going to approach paranormal podcasts, which is, like I talked about, keeping a barrier there that understands that real, frightening things happen. I believe. I've experienced these. I believe that real, frightening things happen. And I've come to the conclusion that I am stronger than that. I went through an anger phase where I was like, you're not going to stop me from talking about the stuff I want to talk about. Let me introduce you to me. Since you've introduced yourself to me, I'm not going to allow this to happen. And I'm going to approach these podcasts much differently from a production value as far as what I do to ready myself before we have these conversations. Now, no one else involved in the podcasts, has to do that. And that's fine. As Rob stated, he began having some scary experiences, seeing a lot of shadow figures. He even did a video on his page about seeing a lot more shadow figures. Had a really rough time, was very uneasy. Jeremy began having a very rough time, started having sleep paralysis and seeing shadow figures, seeing the Hat Man. And that's something he had never experienced before. It was frightening and touched everybody involved. And we have all agreed that if I feel comfortable moving on, since I tend to get the blunt of it, that we will move on. And when I told Jeremy, he said, so you believe you're strong enough to do this? You're ready? And I said, yes. And he said, then I have something I need to tell you. And he said, remember that morning and what happened? And I said, yes. And then he told me about his experience hearing the aggressive, frightening growl of an animal into the phone. And that was what solidified his decision that he no longer wanted to do those type of podcasts. In fact, we were going to be doing a serial killer podcast the next week. And I made the comment, well, serial killers, that should be safe, right? In which case Rob said to me, I bet you never thought you were going to hear yourself say that sentence. And I had to talk Jeremy into doing the next podcast by saying we're not going to talk about anything paranormal. And one of the serial killers I was going to talk about, Wesley Allen Dodd, claimed that he had been possessed by a demon. And I left it out because I didn't feel like A, tempting fate, B, subjecting Jeremy to that, since we were all being affected by it. And that's why the Demon Podcast was the last podcast we did that had anything to do with actual paranormal topics. Even discussing Ed and Lorraine Warren, we tried not to get into the demon parts. Even discussing real hauntings that were turned into movies, we were very conscious of not discussing demon things. So I'm here to say today that if you've wondered why there was such a drastic change and a tone in my channel, that was the reason for what has happened. And for now, we're going to put that away, and we're going to carry on, and we're going to be my channel. And we're going to talk about the subjects we want to talk about. And we're going to talk about scary paranormal activity. And for the next 5 weeks, well, starting in a couple weeks, on August 1st, we're going to talk about the 9/11 conspiracy theories. But I have an interview coming up with someone who does spirit boxes. And we're going to talk about his experiences, the things that he's done in his career. And we're going to be able to talk about some scary stuff up in here. And our podcast will, after the 5 weeks, will be including paranormal activity. Because we as a group are strong. I am feeling in a much better and different place than I've ever felt about paranormal activity before. And I hope that you are interested in continuing this journey with us. And if anything does happen, I will be more able to keep you updated and tell you. And I'm hoping that it doesn't. I'm hoping that my preparation and my mindset stops it from occurring. But I wanted to tell you as a community what's been going on, and it felt like now is the right time. So, if you would like to continue with me on my journey, I would appreciate that. If you have never been to my channel and this is the first time you're hearing anything about this channel, and you like paranormal content, if you like true crime stories, missing persons who have mysteriously disappeared, particularly those in national forests and those type of things, then I encourage you to like my channel, click the like button, and also click that bell so that you can be notified when my content goes live. And if you have sat through this whole thing, I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm sorry. Remember the no editing part? One more thing. Rob and I were having this discussion about me wanting to do these videos again. And I'm going to put a clip into this that shows you what happened during that conversation. Topics, not necessarily pick topics for their quote-unquote entertainment value, if you know what I mean. I need to come at it in a different way, even if it's something that a lot of people are interested in, and it is obviously doing podcasts and whatnot is entertainment, but and you might have been able to hear that breath or whisper in that recording. And I'd also like to say thank you to Jory and Rob and Maya and Jeremy for not only allowing me the space to be able to talk about this, but kind of making it mandatory. I appreciate that. Thank you guys. Now, good night.